Okay,
Got it.
it is 9 o'clock, and we're back from our little short hiatus, Mondays with Moshe, thanks to Passover. And we're back and better than ever. Tonight we have the fortune of hosting the world-renowned Temple Grandin from Colorado. Temple's a professor of animal science in Colorado State University and a great contributor to the world of animal science, to the world of the slaughterhouses, to the world of autism. Temple, you've been such an inspiration for so many of us who've read about your work, watched your TED Talks and other talks, and just really passionate about your advocacy for both the world of cattle and the world of autism. Really a trailblazer, and we really appreciate the work that you've been doing for the past, I don't know how many decades it is now, but I know it's not just a few years at this point.
Cattle industry, it's 50 years.
50 years in the cattle industry.
And about the autism stuff, about 40 years.
40 years. Okay,
Yep.
so I'm over 40, so I'm alive since you started, but I'm not over 50. So you've been in cattle since way before
50 years.
Yeah, since long before I'm born. So Temple, this show is very dear to me, and I'll tell you why. The world of autism, I think, is really mysterious for many clinicians. Many of us go into the field of psychotherapy or psychopharm, and as much as we know that there are people who struggle with autism or who don't struggle with it but who have it, it's really hard for us. Again, I'm speaking for myself, but I think I'm representing the masses. It's really hard for us to appreciate and understand what's really going on inside the minds of these individuals. We see great minds. I mean, before the show, we were just talking about Albert Einstein and Elon Musk and Temple Grandin, right? And some of the great minds who have autism, and we've seen the what they've produced and the brilliance of things they produced. I personally was involved with a teenager with autism who produced the most incredible handiwork, things that were just brilliantly creative. How he saw sink faucets out of spoons and ladles, and it was just fascinating. But at the same time, so many of them are either not verbal or not coherent, and to the regular neurotypical individual, and there's a gap or a disconnect in our ability to communicate. So
I wanted to ask you now. You said you're a therapist, so you're a psychology therapist. What type of therapist?
I'm a clinical social worker.
Clinical social worker. Okay.
Yeah. And many of us don't train to become more familiar with autistic spectrum. We're very busy training in the skills of psychotherapy, and when we come across somebody in treatment with autistic spectrum or autism spectrum, we often can't seem to connect or communicate properly with them. And it's frustrating both for the clinician and for the individual with autism. So with that little introduction, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing for the past 40 or 50 years, some of your accomplishments, and then we'll segue back into this discussion of clinical and autistic spectrum.
Well, professionally, I've done a lot of work on improving the cattle handling equipment. In fact, I've done a lot of work on kosher slaughter restraint devices, and I even discussed this in my book, Thinking in Pictures. I have a lot of information on this on grandin.com. I've designed equipment for every major meat company. I was a child they thought was mentally retarded and wasn't going to accomplish anything. And one of the things that really motivated me when I was in my 20s is I wanted to prove I was not stupid. That was a very big motivation. And if you look at the movie Temple Grandin, they have my projects very accurately shown in that. But it also shows really beautifully how visual thinking works. You see, everything I think about, it's a picture. Okay, you were just asking me, for a keyword. Okay, you can put a keyword into Google, and you made up the keyword claws. Well, I saw an eagle coming down and catching a bird. I'm seeing a hawk attacking a drone. Actually got it down on the ground. I'm now seeing a TV show called Claws about women with nails this long. And I'm now seeing a hotel lady. She had giant long nails, and I was trying to watch how she did use the computer keyboard. Okay, but you see it comes up as a series of pictures. Now I can get off the subject because now I'm in a hotel where I remember their flooded lobby. Someone set a sprinkler off and flooded the lobby. It was a real mess. And they had to shut down the office and let us in through one of the sliding doors into a bedroom. Okay, so how did I, because now I'm thinking about like weird hotel stuff. So now I got out of the clause file and I'm now going through a hotel that served
So
breakfast.
the way you describe it is that there are files of
files.
pictures.
That's right.
Are they
Files of
JP?
pictures.
Are these JPEG or some other format?
Well, that's right. They come up as pictures, and I can, so you can see how to get in the hotel file because a hotel lady was checking me in, and now I'm staying in this horrible hotel I stayed in when they served breakfast in cardboard pint ice cream container. And I go,
Wow.
I will never stay there again.
So you've gone from the claw file to the hotel file by way of association.
That's right. It's by association. You see, and there's some logic in that association because now I'm staying some ice cream containers in my freezer because they're the same containers they served breakfast in at this crazy hotel.
Okay.
Okay, you see how there's an associative link.
Yeah.
But it's associative. It's not linear. Verbal thought's much more linear, but my thinking is associative. And when I do design work, I can control it. And I was drawing up, like steel and concrete construction. I see all the stuff in my mind as I draw it. See, nothing's abstract.
Right.
But there's other autistic people who are the mathematicians, and they're running Silicon Valley. They've given us this Zoom technology we're using right here. And then you have some people on the spectrum, they are word thinkers, strictly word thinkers. And they often love facts, love history, things of this sort.
So okay, there must be differences in the way we as clinicians must communicate with the different kinds of minds, the different kinds of autistic minds, those who are linear thinkers or word thinkers versus visual thinkers.
I am what I do. I have emotions, but I get really emotional about cool stuff. Like I got to visit where the vehicle assembly building, the launch pads at Cape Kennedy. Well, I got really emotional about that because going to the moon was the coolest thing my generation did. And you see, that's what you do. I get emotional about.
And what kind of emotions come up for you?
Well, I get happy. I get cry. I was crying in front of the vehicle assembly building. This was 4.5 years ago. I got a chance to visit. I got inside it. I got up on the roof. They actually have enough scaffolding in there for 6 rockets. Most people don't know that, but I could see the other scaffold things.
Wow.
No, but I am what I do. And this is one of the reasons why I put a lot of emphasis on getting into a career where you feel that you're doing something constructive. Because my sense of identity is definitely tied up with career.
But when you say you, do you mean Temple Grandin?
Temple Grandin. From
Okay.
Temple Grandin, career is what kind of gives my life meaning. In my autism work, I get very happy if a mom writes to me and says, well, I took your recommendations and my kid just got married and bought a house, rather than being holed up in the basement playing video games. Or my kid's got a job and loving it.
Okay, so do you mean that more exclusively to career? So I think the experience you're describing is something that most neurotypical people would experience.
Yeah,
somebody
that's right.
makes a recommendation and they get positive feedback that would make somebody feel happy or excited.
That's right. That's right. That makes me, and I worked with a lot of people in skilled trades and in design work that I know are on the spectrum, socially awkward. I'm now remembering where I had to drag one guy out of a shop at a big beef plant because he was in the shop saying how stupid he thought the plant engineer was. And the plant engineer could hear it. And I remember pulling him out of there. I said, we've got to get out of here. You can't talk like that in his shop.
So okay, and is that to the exclusion of being emotional in areas that other neurotypicals
I
are
don't get
emotional?
emotional. It's I get emotional more over I am what I do. You know, that's why I got very emotional when I went to Cape Kennedy. Um, and when SpaceX did the first crewed spaceship to the space station, I watched the live feed, the whole 3.5 or 4 hour live feed,
Okay.
because I just thought that was just so cool.
Okay, so so if I'm understanding correctly, you're saying what you do is really where most of your life
That's
is
right.
invested in,
What I
both.
am, what I do. And I've written that in, and in some of my things. Also, you also need to just coach them very logically. Okay, on one of my first jobs, my very first plant, I criticized some welding and I said, look like pigeon doo-doo. And the plant engineer pulled me into this office and didn't yell and scream. What he did is he told me very quietly what I should do. First of all, he said that kind of language wasn't appropriate and I'd have to apologize for that. And he made me do that. And then he also explained the chain of command, that if I didn't like the welding, I should have come to him. In other words, he just very calmly told me what I should do.
So almost like teaching a social skill as opposed
Yes,
to
teaching a
getting
social skill.
teaching
Teaching a
social skill.
social skill. It's more like training somebody how to behave in a foreign country.
Right, in a different culture.
It's
Okay.
much more like that.
Okay.
It's not so much what you feel, you just train them on what
So,
they should
so
do.
Temple, tell me, from the autistic spectrum perspective, what are some of the neurotypical, either general population or clinicians missing that we're not really properly understanding about people with autism that we should do differently?
Well, it's sort of like a lot of clinicians, it's more about, emotional connections between people. And for me, it's more logic. I just have to be coached on what I should do.
So
And
it's
what
almost
the
more of
engineer
a
did
it's
on,
more of a
well, regular
psychoeducation.
psychotherapy never did me any good. Let me
Yeah,
tell
that's
you,
what I'm saying. It sounds like
the
it's more
construction people helped me a lot more than the psychotherapist ever did. I'll tell you that right now, because they just told me what I should do.
right. Okay. Now I want to ask you, but I just want to, for those of you who are asking questions in the chat box, please use the reactions
Got one
button.
in there right now.
Just use the actions button on the bottom right of your screen and click the raise your hand button. No reason to be bashful, or plenty of reason to be
But I'm
bashful.
getting everybody's video. I'm getting some videos. That's nice. I like.
Yeah, we like video input. So
Oh yeah, I like to see people's videos. I like to
yes,
see that got people here that we're talking to. That's something that I like. But you look at someone like Elon Musk. He sold all his mansions, and he's living in a boxable at his spaceport, a weird little prefab house. You see, because he is what he does. He found those mansions were stupid. He sold them all. Front page, business section, Wall Street Journal. It's public information.
right. He just needs a Twitter app on his phone and he's good.
Well, he just bought Twitter today.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Just bought it.
So, okay. So just a reminder for those who have questions, use the raise your hand button on the bottom in the reactions tab. So Temple, here's a question. I think what many of us clinicians struggle with is feeling connected. See, again, this may be hard, for us to connect on because you describe yourself as so logical, and I experience myself as very emotional. But I think that the neurotypical or the typical person who is engaging with another is engaging on some level or to a great level on an emotional level. We're watching the nonverbal cues, nonverbal information.
I have to learn all of that like I'm in a foreign country.
But the problem is when we want to engage, when us, let's say clinicians want to engage, and we cannot feel that emotional connection between the clinician and the person with autism.
You don't need it.
What's that?
You may not need it. The thing with let's put it this way. If my mother was in a burning house, I'll get her out of there maybe before you would. Okay, that's how I express caring. If I thought someone was getting in her bank account and doing something bad, I'd do something about it.
But doesn't that entail emotion? Don't you need to feel
No, I just
angry?
I can't let her burn up. I can't let her my biggest emotion is fear.
Okay.
I had horrible anxiety. This is described in detail in my Thinking in Pictures book. There's also a lot of stuff in here on kosher slaughter. I've done a lot of work on that.
Yes.
And I had horrible anxiety. My nervous system was ramped up like there was dangerous predators all over the place, so
Yes.
even though there was nothing. It's all biology. I've been on antidepressant medication for 40 years.
And have they helped?
Oh, yes, they saved me.
Yeah.
Saved me. Saved
And
me.
again,
And
we've
that's
seen
also described in
in the
detail
book.
in my book, Thinking in Pictures. Described in detail. And my colitis attacks cleared up. It completely calmed me down, because for 15 years prior to that, I was looking for an emotional reason for all the anxiety. There wasn't. My amygdala fear center was on overdrive for absolutely no reason. And that's why the chapter is called, in this book, called A Believer in Biochemistry.
Okay. And some would say that that's a sensory component. There's a sensory component
Oh,
to
there
that.
is, and some of it is sensory. And
So can you
sensory,
explain that?
well, sensory problems, when I was a little kid, loud noise really set me off. And sometimes you can help a kid get over, let's say in the gym, the buzzer on the scoreboard, the kid's afraid of that. But you take them down to the gym when no one's there and let him play with a button. They'll end up tapping tunes out on it. If they can control that dreaded noise. Now, I've talked to people that are on the spectrum that went to work for a computer company, and half those programmers are probably undiagnosed. And I had one lady say to me, I'm with my people now. Because the most interesting conversations are not these emotional chit chat conversations. They go too fast for me to follow. I have a slow processor speed. I can't follow those conversations. But you want to get into a big discussion about concrete forming systems. Oh, that was a wonderful 2-hour plane flight. We talked about tilt-ups. That's how you build warehouses. And concrete forming with another construction manager for a 2-hour flight. That was a great flight. You see, that is a friend through shared interest.
Yes.
That's
But there's very little emotion.
Talking about that stuff and solving problems with it.
But the only emotion that's coming through is I am what I do. In other words,
Well, I have emotions like when people bullied me. I got kicked out of school for fighting. And what I had to learn is I had to learn to go from anger to crying, because crying doesn't get you in trouble.
it elicits pity.
Well, I used to hide. Every time I go by a room, like a door that says electrical room, when I worked in the meat plants and I'd get in the hassle, I'd go hide in the electrical rooms because nobody would go in there. I know what not to touch. A proper electrical room is all enclosed anyway. But I'd go in there because I didn't want anybody to see me, or I'd hide under the stairs in the basement.
Temple, one of my greatest struggles in working with children, whether it's children or teenagers with who are on the spectrum, is that oftentimes they can become aggressive with siblings, with classmates, and as much as us mental health professionals want to be understanding and empathic.
Well, there's a point. What happened with me, I switched from anger to crying. That's how I dealt with aggression. Period.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the people on the spectrum who are aggressive.
Well, we have to, all right, now let's find out why they're aggressive. One of the problems we've got with the spectrum is we're going from Elon Musk to somebody who may have epilepsy and cannot dress themselves. And they use the same word. It is called the exact same word.
Right.
And they have very, very different problems. That's the thing that's a big issue. And I had a science teacher that, we did science projects together. That got me motivated. But okay, let's say we got an aggression problem. Okay, now is this and let's not talk about 3-year-olds here. Let's get a little older. 6th grade, high school. All right. Is the client verbal? Can they talk?
Yeah, the client is, yes.
Fully verbal. Okay, now what sets off the aggression? Sometimes it's sensory. They get in a place where there's too much noise. What because they can't talk, frustration because they cannot communicate can be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
If they're nonverbal, maybe they got the stomach ache and they can't tell you about it. We have to look at what is setting off the aggression.
And so, and you know, again, one of the challenges that we face is that we don't always know what it is, and we don't always have a child who's motivated to tell us. They just want everybody to go away, or they just want to walk around hitting children, and they're not really communicating what's going on. And they're, you know, we're not
Well,
prophets.
there were some consequences for aggression. I had horseback riding taken away for 2 weeks. And that's when I switched to crying. I was still getting bullied. Most of my aggression was caused by bullying. It was a direct response to being called names and being bullied.
Right.
And the only places I was not bullied, is very important with these kids, especially the fully verbal ones, friends who shared interests. It might be music. It might be Torah studies. I mean, just a whole lot of stuff. It might be art. It might be science projects, robotics, computer programming, all these different things where you can have a friend through shared interests.
So it sounds like it's
emphasize that enough.
So it sounds like a part of the treatment plan in working with these children would be to really problem solve and find them an outlet that's mutually shared, you know, some kind of extracurricular or hobby or outlet that's shared mutually with other children.
Well,
That's
that's
outside of
where
the
you
box.
see where I get fun is friends who shared interests. I mean, I was like one enterprising teacher. She had like a 5th grader, had a lot of problems. He liked Star Wars, so she started a Star Wars club. I mean, this was a simple thing to do. And then the other children, you know, now he had friends through Star Wars. Also, these kids, when they're little, we have to teach them how to wait and take turns. They can't always be first. See, in a lot of things that you do, you have to take turns.
And how do we teach children on the spectrum to be motivated to take turns? Like they just say,
Well,
I don't care.
It starts with 3-year-olds, just little games like Candyland or something like that. You start with that. You start with that.
And is the learning process expected
Yep.
to take
The
longer?
other thing is, I got a lot of, like when I was in my high school, I got sent to special school. I didn't do any studying for 3 years. I ran a horse barn for 3 years. Very expensive school of horse barn management, but I learned how to work. And this is the other big problem I'm seeing with the young autistic adults who are not learning working skills. I'm seeing too many parents overprotect. They're not learning how to go in a store and buy stuff. They're not learning bank account.
Why is that?
Well, they just get overprotected. What I'm seeing, this is another book here that did with Deborah Moore, Navigating Autism. This is the book for new parents that are newly diagnosed to read, so they don't get so locked into the label that they can't see their whole kid. But I'm seeing where they get locked into the label and they don't think the kid could do anything. I'm appalled at the number of teenagers, fully verbal, that have never gone shopping by themselves. They've never walked up to the counter at a McDonald's and ordered their food, you know, just basic.
Is there a reason that they're being overprotected by their parents?
Well, it's just, this is what's happening. And then the granddad that has a good job, like a pharmacist, a builder, maybe an engineer or an accountant, he had a paper route when he was 11 and learned working skills. Big problem is that academic skills and working skills are not the same kind of skills.
Correct.
See, Elon Musk, when he was young, he did some dirty jobs like cleaning out tanks. He also was very persistent, and he got an internship which got him into the PayPal stuff. But that all goes back to when he was a young kid. He was working and doing entrepreneur stuff. He was selling video games, not playing them.
Right.
Making them and selling them.
Temple, can we talk a little bit about the child on the spectrum's perspective of his parents, his neurotypical parents or her neurotypical parents? Do they understand? And again, I know you can't speak for everybody clearly, but you've done a lot of research. Do they understand or have empathy towards their primary caregivers and recognize how in some ways they're making it difficult for the family, in some ways
Well, they can
or is
recognize.
it only very it seems sometimes like very self-absorbed, and
Well, this is where this goes back to teaching the little ones to take turns, because that's the first thing that teaches them that there's other people in the world, and it doesn't always go your way, and you still got to do activities the rest of the family wants to do. You see, you can't always be first in line. You don't always win the game.
And is there an effective way to teach that? Because some of these kids will have tantrums, they'll destroy property, they'll break things, just out of the sheer
All right, now, first of
frustration.
all, I want to know, before we troubleshoot a particular kid, and I'm
Yeah.
going to use the engineering terminology,
Okay.
because I want to bust you out of the medical box. First of all, age, and does the kid speak?
I'm talking about children who speak, who are verbal, but not necessarily expressive. Again, this is
Okay, so they might only be partially verbal. In other words, they could ask you they wanted the juice, but they
but they
can't
can,
carry on a
I don't
conversation.
know if they can or they don't. It's like but the way we see it, the way I see this population often is that the emotional frustration goes from 0 to 100 so quickly. We call them explosive kids. They'll go from 0
Yep.
to 100 so quickly because they're not getting their way, and the
Well,
sensory.
one of the things, this goes back to, we need to teach the little ones that, yeah, you don't always get your own way.
Yeah.
And if we're playing a game, you have to take turns playing the game.
And I'm looking for the most humane and effective way to teach that to children.
Board games, simple board games. And I was born in 1947, so they didn't have any children's board games right after the war. And so we used a Parcheesi board, which is a game where you shake dice and you move little pieces around, and you have to take turns doing it. And I always, I had to learn to wait my turn. I mean, I was like 5 when we were doing that.
And what was that like for you? What was it like for you to be forced into a box where you have to wait your turn? And even though
It
you
wasn't,
needed to
it wasn't really all that bad. I mean, I would grab the little shaker cup, and mother would just say, it's Izzy's turn, it's Izzy's turn. In other words, what you want to do with these kids, don't scream no when they do something wrong. Okay, we're sitting at the dining room table, and the kid decides to stir his drink with his finger. Instead of screaming no, just give the instruction. Use the spoon. Other people think that's gross when you do that. Just calmly, or you lick the. When I was in grade school, I went down and I lapped some ice cream like a dog. And I'll never forget, my teacher just picked it up and took it away and said, "You're not a dog." And I didn't have any ice cream that day. I never forgot it. Just really calmly like that.
Wow.
It was melted chocolate ice cream. I was either in 3rd or 4th grade. I remember it very well.
So you remember it today. I'm assuming that left an impression on you.
It did. But what you do is you give the instruction. Big problem is the kid starts to do something wrong. They go, no.
Yeah, they're telling them what to not do, as opposed to telling them the
tell them
corrective,
what they should do.
how to correct it.
You want to tell them what they should do calmly. And now there's some individuals, let's say of a nonverbal adolescent, and he can't tell you that his stomach hurts or some other pain. A lot of the nonverbals, they can't tell you they're hurting, that their stomach aches, or they got an earache or some other problem they can't tell you about.
So how do we find that? How do we discover that?
Well, it's just very simply, they grab themselves around the stomach. Why don't you try giving some acid reflux medicine and get the head of the bed up to keep the acid in the stomach. Because it's going to be stomach, they got bowel issues or earaches or toothaches. These urinary tract infections, these things are pretty easy to diagnose. You got to rule that stuff out with a nonverbal that can't tell you where he hurts.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about relationships.
The best marriages I've seen, I'm not married, I'm celibate, have been shared interests. 2 computer programmers, 2 artists, 2 people with shared interests. Those have usually been the best relationships.
Have you seen
a lot of problems with women on the spectrum getting into abusive relationships. Big problem. So
what do you mean by that? You mean that they
want a relationship so bad they'll tolerate a guy's hitting them, threatening to kill their cats.
Why is a woman on the spectrum so desperate to get into a relationship?
Well, she wants to be included, but this is a big problem. Well, I like things really simple. If the guy hits me, he's gone. If he threatens any kind of threatening or threaten my pets, gone. And the other thing is guys that are too controlling, that like cut the girl off even from her girlfriends, gone. In food safety, we call it critical control points. What are the things that really matter? Right now, we've got a salmonella case in breakfast cereal. And I've got to find out where that went wrong in that factory. You can't measure everything in that factory. I love the critical control point approach. That's what I told some other counseling people. He hits, no relationship. He threatens your pet, no relationship. And he tries to cut you off, especially from your family or from your girlfriends, bye-bye.
Right.
You see, that's a very logical, almost like a computer approach.
So it's what I'm finding so like, I guess, fascinating and confusing at the same time is that there seems to be a strong desire for connection.
Yes, there is.
You use the word inclusion, which is very interesting,
But
as opposed
there's
to
a
like
strong word for connection. But where I've had the best connection is, okay, we'd be out on a job building some stuff and sitting in the job trailer talking about how to solve problems and build stuff. That's where I've had some of the best connection. Just talking about how to, then we got to talk about how dumb the suits are.
So it's like two people next to each other talking to each other about a common interest is what's going to get you excited, and what's going to work for the person on the autistic spectrum.
Well, I have a friend that's happily married. She's a computer programmer. She's married to another programmer. And you know what she said? We had romantic dinner. We were dating. We had candles. We had white tablecloths. We got to have all that stuff because you got to set the stage for a wonderful 4-hour conversation on computer data storage systems. Because they're just so interesting.
But that's their concept of romance.
There's something, they're just so interesting. Just like I talked this late on this plane, we talked about tilt-up warehouse construction and concrete forming for a 2-hour flight. We had a great time.
Right.
And I kind of approach a lot of the autism. So how do I solve the problem with the kid? Okay, video game addictions, I'll tell you how to get them off. Car mechanics. They discover that the cars are more interesting than the video games.
So we have to provide an alternative. We have to provide some alternative that's more exciting or more stimulating than the computer game.
Yeah, and it's not going to be shelving groceries. I'll tell you right now. It's going to where I only know 4 successes right now. You see, I'm a bottom-up thinker. I use specific examples to make concepts, and I got 4 specific examples where young adults were successfully weaned off of video games with car mechanics, not working in a grocery store.
Okay. I mean, you know, I see one of the greatest challenges, and I wish you could help us with this more, is if we take somebody on the autistic spectrum, we get them off the computer, we put them in a car, auto body shop or a mechanic shop, and then they have a difficult time getting along with people in the shop, and it's really difficult.
Well, I can tell you there's some simple rules. Sex, religion, and politics, don't bring them to work, period. That's a rule.
Oh, okay.
Leave those subjects at home. Sports,
you're talking about,
you can bring to work, weather you can bring to work, pets you can talk about.
Okay, but I understand you're talking about topics, and where they're not getting along, and I'm talking more about social understanding, such as stepping on each other's toes, or incessantly asking questions, or something that's annoying to the other person.
I've had to learn by being trained that annoys people.
Okay.
Like when I was in high school, the other kids got sick of me going on and on talking about carnival rides over and over and over again.
Okay. Look, can we take a question? Naomi,
Yep, sure.
Please unmute if you can. And I know you can't get your video on, but that's fine. We'll take the question anyway.
But thank you so much. I had a question. It's an interesting question. I find that in working with, I'm specifically thinking of a teenager who is on the spectrum, but even younger children. Typically, a lot of what we do is getting them to know the feelings, understand their feelings, as far as neurotypical children. But when it comes to children who are on the spectrum, I really wonder what their experience is with feelings. Like you mentioned, that your primary go-to feeling was fear.
Oh yeah, fear is my primary thing. And even now, I might do the conference and I go, now I say something, I got somebody, hackles up. You see, now when I say that, I see a dog's hackles going up. Yeah, when I said that.
Right. So my question is, you're calling it fear, but sometimes I'll have, let's say I'm thinking of a client who will be describing something, let's say like bullying. Now, it doesn't.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, I would, at first I reacted with anger and fists, and I got in trouble for that. And then after that, I reacted with crying, which didn't get in trouble, but I was still completely miserable. And the only places I was away from bullying was our shared interests: horses, electronics, and model rockets. And the kids that bullied did not do those activities.
So I'm wondering about the feeling, like the fact that the go-to feeling is fear. It would make both logical and emotional sense to me as someone who is neurotypical, that the feeling would be sadness, pain, a feeling of being other, being excluded.
Yep, and I don't like being excluded.
Those feelings.
But the other problem I have is that a lot of neurotypicals do these really fast chit-chat conversations where they talk back and forth really, really fast. And these conversations usually have very little content. They're very emotional. First of all, I don't have the processor speed to follow those conversations. It goes by too fast. And I interrupt, and people say, well, you interrupt. And one of the reasons why I interrupt is my processor speed is too slow. I'm like a phone on 1 bar service. Now that doesn't affect doing design work because that's all long-term memory stuff.
Mhm. What about feelings like excitement, hurt,
Oh, I get that. I get really
sadness? Do you ever feel
excited
sad?
about it. I get
Feel
really excited
sad?
about stuff that works right. I get really excited about that. I get real happy about that.
What about sadness or hurt?
Yep, I can get I can get sad, but it tends to be more short term. And also, people complain when they go on antidepressants, it blunts emotion. But my fear system was so ramped up that getting on the medication made me feel normal. And I heard another lady talk about, after she went through a whole lot of tragedy in her family, that she went on Prozac and it made her feel normal because she, and when I went on antidepressants, I've been on them for 40 years. And again, I talk about my experiences with antidepressants, my Thinking in Pictures book. They saved me. But I get really happy about cool stuff. And I've done a lot of things to improve animal welfare equipment that I learned, like a lot of engineers have to learn, that you can't replace management with equipment. It has to be managed.
Temple, could I ask one more question related to what I was saying? Have you've been in this for a long time. In as far as you can remember, have you ever experienced either joy or sadness as a reaction to another person?
Well, I have.
Great question.
I grew up, if you read my mother's book, her marriage was, she got divorced. When I went out to my aunt's ranch, my aunt's husband, he was a bad alcoholic. And when he got drunk, he swear for 5 hours straight and use every bad word in the book. I'm not going to repeat it. So he was like a Jekyll and Hyde. When he was sober, he was nice. And when he was drunk, he was horrible. And I never saw a marriage I could see myself getting in. And I've seen too much stuff with abusive men. I got no use for that. I'd rather go out and help design something.
Temple.
But on the other hand, I tell parents, okay, your autistic son will save you in a fire, but let me tell you, he'll save the cats too.
Do you ever feel love towards another person?
There's some, my emotions are simpler. They're a lot simpler. Also, I don't think verbally. I have simpler emotions. You know, I can get upset about something and then it's sort of like an afternoon thunderstorm. It goes on through. And I like to be involved in doing things. And I had one of my friends say to me one time, well, you don't feel sympathy for my health problems. You just try to fix them. Well, yeah, I do. And I've had a lot of chronic health problems that I have fixed, saved my hearing. I don't think you want to go into all the discussion, but I've had a lot of kind of chronic health problems that I have fixed them.
So
urinary tract infections, I fixed it with probiotics.
So when you say you would, you know, you had told me if your mother was in a burning building, you'd
I'll
jump
get her
in.
out of the burning building
But what would compel you to if you don't
because
feel
it's the right thing
love,
to do. Loyalty,
loyalty and logic,
loyalty.
and that you don't consider that to be there to be any feeling in that.
Well, I have feeling, you know, there'd be an urgency. You know, I got to do something about it.
So a sense of urgency, but not out of. In other words, here's something as a neurotip.
Okay.
I'm going to describe an experience that I would have. If God forbid there were a burning building and I knew that there was somebody in there, I'd feel panicky and I'd feel the fear of the person who's in there who may be.
No, I just got to get them out of there, not burn myself up in the process.
So you don't
Because
feel their
they're going to
pain.
just get burned to a crisp if they're in a burning building. I got to get them out of there.
And what's wrong with them being burnt to a crisp in your mind?
Well, it's going to hurt. I know it's going to hurt.
It's going to hurt. And
It's gonna
why
hurt
can't
a
it
whole
hurt?
lot. Now I'm seeing horrible pictures from when the World Trade Center and people were jumping like off the 100th floor.
And you're connecting with that sense of
Well,
pain
yeah,
and hurt.
like that's horrible. I can imagine what that pain would be like.
So that is empathy.
Yeah, I would imagine what that pain is like. Absolutely.
And would that compel you to try to save them?
If I could.
Would
But
that compel you?
I don't think I would take a risk where it's walking to a blast furnace and I just.
Yeah, okay. But would
I'm
that
not gonna do that.
good, I understand that. Would the feeling of pain that you're experiencing watching them jump or thinking about the person in the burning fire, would that feeling that you get compel you to save them? Or is it only the logic that it's the right thing to do?
It's pretty much the logic. And I had things where I used to be terrified of airplanes because this is what before I went on the medication, because I was in a very scary emergency landing. But you know how I get over that? I learned more about planes and made it interesting. I got to fly in the cockpit of a big Constellation that was taking heifers to Puerto Rico, learn more about aviation. I can usually, a lot of plane crashes, I haven't figured out what caused them before the FFA's figured it out.
Wow. Okay.
I often haven't figured out. There's a Chinese one that crashed. I think the plane lost a horizontal stabilizer. Let's see if I'm right on that.
Okay, you heard it here first, folks.
Okay.
All right, let's take a question from Tzipora. Go ahead, Tzipora.
Hi, I'm curious. I'm hearing you talk a lot about having to learn to readapt and change in order to, you know, function.
Well, let's talk about. I one of the things I worked on, and I was very motivated, was there was this kosher plant back in 1980 called Spencer Foods, and they were really awful. And they hung the cattle up by their ankle, and the cattle were screaming their heads off. And my approach was, I'm going to get rid of this system. So I drew a drawing, and I did some trips where I paid for plane tickets. And it's like, I'm going to fix this. This is the most dreadful thing I've ever seen. We're going to put better equipment in. No, I was very highly motivated to fix it.
Tzipora, what was your question?
I can now, I'm playing the video back in my mind right now. I can hear those poor things bellowing. You could hear them in the cafeteria. You could hear them in the office. Cattle bellowing their heads off.
If I can just ask, I'm just curious where that motivation to learn came from. Was that something that you came to decision on?
One of the things, I have a big motivation to problem solve.
Mhm.
Like even with my own health problems, I like when COVID hit, I read every paper. Okay, there's all the controversy about the different medications, so I'm not going to mention any names. Let me believe it, I had them all, and I think I could have saved my butt with them. but I went very, very deep into the scientific literature. And that helped me way deeper than any doctor would. Well, there might be a few researchers that might have. And I was very careful. I didn't fly for an entire year until I was vaccinated. Now I'm not worried about COVID. I'm fully vaccinated now.
Temple.
Yeah.
Tzipora, maybe this will help you, but somebody's
But it made me less afraid to have this knowledge.
Mhm. So I'm just wondering, like you mentioned that you had to learn to be sad instead of angry, or that you had to learn, like Moshe gave an example of somebody in the workplace behaving in a certain way.
I had to get him out of there because we were going to all get fired. I was in there in the guy's shop calling him stupid. And then, of course, I started having a fear reaction because I was afraid it would jeopardize the project. And I said, we got to get out of here. You can't talk like this. You're in his shop. I said, stop it, stop it, stop it. I had to hold him out of there. It jeopardized getting our project done. You can't go in there and call clients stupid.
Temple, one of our listeners made an interesting observation. She says that the way that you're describing your motivation to help those cattle sounds like what a neurotypical person would describe as empathy towards the cattle.
Yeah,
Do you
definitely.
find-
I could imagine what it'd feel like to get yanked up in the air by a chain around your ankle. I certainly.
So do you
that's empathy to their pain, but you see, some people would feel so much empathy that they couldn't logically do something about it.
Yeah.
It made me angry. I said,
Yeah.
I am going to fix Spencer.
Yeah. But do you find that you experience more empathy towards animals and cattle than towards people? Because that I've heard that argument made.
If someone's doing that stuff to people, I feel empathy about that. I have a real cruelty. That's something that
Justice, do you find the same thing with justice? Do you find justice to be the same?
You look at things that cruel crap that people do. And I wrote my book Animals in Translation. The thing I found in studying animal behavior is the animals with the biggest brains, like the dolphins and the chimpanzees, they were capable of some of the kindest behavior, but they were also capable of some of the cruelest behavior, like dolphins gang raping females. Well, it's the big brained animals that. Working on conversation skills, it's sort of like being in a play. And then people on the spectrum will talk about masking, and there's things I had to learn. The first thing is you couldn't be a rude, filthy, dirty slob. Clean it up.
But what about conversation? That's a great point. What about conversation skills? That people will want to interact with the person on the spectrum more.
Well, you learn how to, what I can't do is there's a kind of chit chat, social chit chat with people. They'll do it in a noisy restaurant, and the conversation is almost no information. The chit chat back and forth, laughing, having a great time, and my eyes glaze. So I can't follow it. I can't hear it, and I can't follow it. My processor speed is simply too slow. Now, what tends to happen to me when like I went to a little party we had for an employee today that's getting promoted out of our department to another job, is I went over and chit-chatted with this person, and then I went over and talked to another person. In other words, I kind of went around the room when I talked individually to people, because when you get like 4 or 5 people together chit-chatting back and forth, I interrupt because I don't have the processor speed to break into the conversation at the right time.
What about on a one-on-one? What about in a one-on-one?
I'm fine with one-on-one.
You are?
Fine.
Okay, I got it.
That's fine.
Let's take a question from Devora.
Hi, good evening, Dr. Grandin. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I wanted to ask you what you do today when you feel like you're overloaded. I remember you talking about compression as a child. What do you do today when you feel overloaded by either a crowd or crying people or loud noises? What works for you as an adult?
Well, I find, like I'm at the airport and I'm just I'm not older now, so I've got back pain, and it's hard to stand all day. And I just got to find a chair, find a window ledge, something I can sit on, and then I can tune it out.
When did you learn?
To sit down.
How did you learn what regulates you?
Well, the medication helped a whole lot because when something would happen, my reaction would be nowhere near as intent. You know, people complain that Prozac blunts emotions, but I was like in a state of fear over absolutely nothing. And I knew it was nothing. And for 10 years, I actually psychologically looked for my deep, dark psychological secrets. Well, what made the anxiety go away was medication, not my deep, dark psychological secrets.
You described this earlier to me as your amygdala being on fire all the time.
It was on fire for no reason. And it turned out it's 3 times larger than normal.
No kidding. No
That
kidding.
showed up in the brain scan. And that's all written up in the Autistic Brain book. Also in this book, I described the 3 different kinds of autistic thinking: the visual thinker like me, the mathematical thinker, and then the word thinker.
So can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, I've talked about how all my thoughts are pictures. I talked about how I was seeing the ice cream containers and things like that. You see, and I see that as pictures. The mathematical thinkers, it's more patterns. They see patterns. They don't see photographic images. And then I've talked to people that are fully verbal, and everything is words. And what I've noticed about verbal thinking, regular verbal thinking, they tend to overgeneralize. They'll say, well, we got to have an inclusive classroom, but they don't tell you how you're going to do it. See, my mind works in specific examples. All right, here's a thing that worked, here's something that didn't work, and I start putting them in slots on a spreadsheet in my mind. Now, to make that kind of thinking work, you got to fill the database with a ton of stuff. And so I didn't think my thinking got real flexible until I got into my 40s. And I had enough information in the database. You see, you've got to fill the database. It's sort of like when the internet first started, I remember you typed cattle and there was like 2 websites.
Okay.
You've got to put information into the database. Then you learn, well, I miscalculated on that. I won't make that mistake again. It's bottom-up thinking. I think the way artificial intelligence thinks.
So Dr. Grandin, in terms of, let's say, directing this question from a parent to a child, where the child has so many needs of the parent, and the parent is the one that has the spectrum.
First of all, we got to break this down. I got to break down what the problem is. First of all, age of the child and the kind of
No. I'm asking if the parent is on the spectrum. So the parenting person, the mother, definitely has significant features of autism. What would be some of your suggestions? What has worked for you in terms of her being flooded by all of the needs of parenting and a workplace, etc.?
All right, first of all, let's break down each thing. You see, this is an example of verbal overgeneralization.
Okay.
We're going to mixing parenting and work together. Okay, now does she have a little baby? Okay, what is, I have to learn more about it.
So let's say a child who is a year old and wants mother's attention all the time, as is normal.
Yeah.
And the mother becomes very overwhelmed by that. It takes a lot of energy. That's how she describes it. It takes so much energy for me to, right? So much energy for me to always be parenting this child, to the point where she becomes physically and emotionally exhausted. By the end of the day, she's empty.
If she's in a situation where she could pay to get some help with the child, that take care of the child, I would recommend that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any other strategies that would fill her up on her spreadsheet? Some of those coping strategies that might be available to her.
Things like, okay, let's say I'm at the airport and I'm kind of overwhelmed. I just want to get a chair and sit down. Okay. It's worse when I can't find a place to sit. And the other thing I can't stand, like, always get to the airport super early because I hate the anxiety. Okay, now we've got a traffic jam on the highway. Am I going to get there?
Well, that's what you described as the sensory piece, where the feelings are felt very strongly.
Well, yeah, and it's like fear. It's a whole bunch of fear.
So the strategy, okay.
The strategy is when I do things like allow plenty of time.
Okay.
I always allow an hour, a whole hour, to have some kind of problem go wrong on I-25, which it does every once in a while, going to the airport so I can have an hour screw up somewhere and still make the flight. And then I have my things I do at the airport, a restaurant I go to. I'll go and I'll buy a newspaper, and then I go sit in McDonald's, and and then I go down to the gate and I do my phone calls. Or I get my shoes shined. I have my stuff I do at the airport.
Got it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, this seems maybe even a little off the topic, but I'm fascinated by the poster that's behind you. It says Hubble spacecraft telescope and the time machine. And I'm wondering, what can you tell me about that?
Well, I put that up out there on purpose, actually.
Oh, okay.
Well, when I think about some of the great questions of the universe, I'll look at the Hubble Deep Space Field. That's the picture up, the picture down on the lower right-hand corner. When they did that picture, they pointed the Hubble at a blank area of space and found thousands of galaxies. I'm thinking all the great unanswered questions.
Mm-hmm.
I just look at that.
So that's like an infinite thought.
That's right. That's right. But I have to have a picture. It's a Hubble Deep Space Field. And then, of course, I had to put a picture of cattle there.
Yeah.
And then the other stuff is just some little animal knickknacks. But
And the
no, I
time
put that
machine?
Hubble Space Telescope there on purpose.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I did. And then over there on the other side, I've got a cattle award. You can see a green and yellow ribbon. I just was awarded distinguished professor at Colorado State University.
Uh-huh.
That's my medal back there. That also was deliberately put there.
Uh-huh. And the time machine, what's that related to?
Well, the time machine is just that's the Hubble poster. It says that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's part of the Hubble. I didn't put time machine on it. That was on the poster.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the classic old poster too. Oh, an ADHD and autism link, yes. The genetics is about 1/3 of the genetics overlaps, and about 1/3 of the brain scan stuff overlaps. There's a lot of crossover with ADHD and autism, lots. I can answer that one quick.
Okay, are you familiar with ABA therapy?
Yes, I am.
Behavioral analysis, and is this something you agree to as a form of treating or helping individuals with
It
autism?
depends upon how you do it. You see, the problem is you've got all these different types of ABA, and some of these advocates were subjected to some really bad ABA where they were driven into sensory overload, which is completely terrible. The other thing I've noticed, if we're working with 3-year-olds, what I've noticed is that a good teacher does the same things regardless of the name of the program. Certain teachers have the knack to engage these little kids and start with the turn taking. And the thing I talk to parents of very young children, I'm talking 3-year-olds here that are nonverbal, is who is that teacher? Is the teacher effective? What's an effective teacher for a 3-year-old? I got 4 critical control points using the food safety concept. Are you getting more speech? Are you getting more turn taking at games like it could be Candyland? Are you getting more skills like brushing your teeth, washing your hands, putting a t-shirt on? And then the 4th thing is the child should like going to therapy. That's for real little kids. 4 simple things. Now here's some hints. Slow down when you talk to the kid and give the kid time to respond. They're like a phone with 1 bar service trying to download a web page. You got to give them time to respond. That's real little
great tip.
kids.
Really important tip there. Okay,
But
let's take.
I think there's some ABA done on fully verbal kids that's too rigid and just gets stupid. Also, we need to keep it real. You don't set and unset the table 10 times in a row. You teach the things as you do it. You don't put a coat on and off 5 times. We got to keep things more real.
So in the context, keep it in
It depends
context.
upon how they see. There's a lot of stuff called ABA. Now in New York State, there's some real rigid stuff that I don't like.
Let's take a question from Dina Malka. Go ahead, Dina.
Hi, okay. So thank you. We mentioned a little bit before about conversation, like conversation skills. And I'm wondering are you ever intrinsically motivated and when you're having a conversation, like actually curious about the other person? Or is it more just about being polite?
No, I care about the other person, I ask them about their job and are they doing well in that. You know, talk about a lot of health stuff. I've had a lot of health problems and I fixed them too. I go deep into Google Scholar, really deep. I know how to search Dr. Google, and I throw his nonsense out.
Right.
But I
But Dina's asking,
I
she's
like
asking,
talking about work stuff, but I'm always a problem solver.
but
Problem
I
solving is
think
something I really like
Dina
doing.
Malka's, her question is an important question. When you're talking about health stuff with a peer or a friend, right? Is it only the health stuff and the common place that you're engaged in, or do you also watch to see whether the other person is happy, whether do you feel feelings towards the person also, or is it only the topic at hand?
Well, it's sort of like an engineer's approach. Engineers fix stuff. It made me really happy. I remember I had a real low income family come up to me as I had talked about, acid reflux in nonverbal adults. And this lady says, "Oh, I gave my son Prevacid. Oh, saved us." That's an acid reflux over the counter medication. Saved us. He now sleeps through the night because we got the acid reflux under control. That made my night.
Right. So it's more like if someone's telling you something and you feel like you could help them problem solve, but is it ever like just for the sake of like being curious about the other person, like about a story that happened to them or
Oh
something
yeah,
that they went
I'm interested in those sort of things. That kind of stuff interests me. But what I've noticed sometimes when they're like 4 or 5 people get together, they do this chit chat talk, and they're emotionally engaged. It's very rapid, and the conversation has almost no information,
Right.
and I can't follow it.
Right. And if it's one-to-one, such a conversation, does it
One-to-one
interrupt
conversations work a lot
here?
better, a whole lot better.
Because you care about the person, so you want to know like what happened to them, or
Well, I can also hear them. You got to remember, a lot of problems is processing speed. I'm a 1-bar phone, but I have the cloud for memory.
right.
You're
So
trying
when
to
there's
access everything through a 1-bar phone with 1 bar of service.
right. So when there's chit chat with 4 or 5 people, it's not that you don't want to join or listen, but it's more like that it's hard for you to do that.
I can't process it. You
It's
see, and then when
right.
you talk about the masking and people getting fatigued, these big chit chat parties, I'm usually off one corner talking to one person. And then I've learned when I've kind of worn out my welcome, I need to move on. I've kind of
Right.
learned how to.
Right.
Okay, Shiffy, let's take a question from you. Go ahead, Shiffy.
I have 2 things to say. First of all, the way you describe going off, when you're at a party and you go off to the side and you talk to one person, that sounds like an introvert. I'm an introvert, and that's me at a party, off to one side, talking to one person. I can't stand that big crowd with a lot of chit chat. Maybe I'm on the spectrum, not sure.
Well, I can't hear it for one thing. I can't follow it. Like, I don't really like stand-up comedians because by the time I've laughed at one joke, he said 3 more. It's going by too fast.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
I don't really care much for those shows.
The question I have for you, you describe fear as your primary emotion, the emotion that you recognized in yourself the most. Is that something in your experience that you find across the board with many people?
Fear is that a lot of people on the spectrum, it's fear. And the medication like cut the fear way down.
Would you say that the fear comes from a place of being just misunderstood forever and ever?
No, I think there's a biological problem. The thing that amazed me is when I went on the meds, is how well they worked.
And the size of the amygdala, when you pointed out.
Well, on my amygdala, you see, this was an experimental brain scan, but my amygdala was 3 times larger. My right amygdala was 3 times larger than normal.
Wow.
So my fear system was just going nuts for absolutely no reason. And then I actually charted it in the 80s, right before I went on the medication. I was charting whether it was out of town or in town. There was no correlation.
So in other words, there's no antecedent to the fear other than just plain fear.
Well, and then when I did, back in the 70s, I read an article called The Promise of Biological Psychiatry. And it had 2 doctors in it. And this is back when you had to use those big Index Medicus phone book things full of abstracts. I tracked down this paper on endogenous anxiety, and it had 10 symptoms. I had 8 out of the 10. Thank goodness I learned how to use the library, but I resisted the idea of taking medication. So I laid the paper aside, and then I had to have a very, very stressful eye surgery. And I was waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, worrying about going blind. And I pulled out the paper again, and I went to the doctor, and I just faked depression to get the meds. That's what you do in construction. When you need parts, you get them.
Okay, Zalman, let's take a question from Zalman. Go ahead.
Hi, Temple. I'm a big admirer of your work. Just had a question. In some of your work, you talk about high functioning ASD. A lot of times they have a strong long-term memory. Like you keep talking about, they have a strong, like a cloud. You're able to store memory very well, but processing short-term list of instructions is a struggle.
I have no short-term memory. One of the things at work, let's avoid getting fired at work. Make yourself a pilot's checklist of how to take apart the ice cream machine or whatever, or the deli slicer or whatever the thing is at work. Make yourself a pilot's checklist. I cannot remember long strings of sequential information.
Right.
Just can't. I have to write it down.
What's interesting is a lot of times clinicians will say, I'm not sure if this client is struggling with trauma or they're on the spectrum. And I wonder if this is the connection. The fact that people with autism are able to recall information in a very vivid way is what can contribute to a traumatic experience.
Well, yes, there is research, and I have looked it up, and I've got a new book coming out on visual thinking. You can pre-order now on Amazon, Visual Thinking by Temple Grandin.
I have your books.
And people that have the worst PTSD tend to remember the stuff as pictures.
Right. Because even
Now,
when
when
you
I
brought
think
up
now about the scary plane thing where we went down the slides, I just looked at it a video, like a YouTube video now. I'm playing that back right now. I'm having no reaction to it now. You see, my reactions are more in the present. And then I used to go on this horrid little airplane. It was called a Fokker. Boy, air traffic controllers used to like to say it some other way. Won't repeat that. And when that thing put the gear down, I was sure the belly was falling out. And then when I learned more about how planes worked, made them interesting, you know, I'm going, I got to find out what happened to that Chinese plane. I think it lost a horizontal stabilizer. They find that like 10 miles from where it crashed. That's my diagnosis. I don't know. I can tell you what they're going to find on the voice recorder. If a horizontal stabilizer came off, there'll be one steady stream of swear words on that recorder. Or just screaming. But he did manage to get some control of the plane, but it was. That's what flight tracker showed.
So Zalmi, do you want to repeat? Was your question answered?
I think so. Basically, the fact that people are able to recall information, as you see, they're able to recall information in a very vivid way, is what can contribute to trauma.
Well, then some people that makes the PTSD worse.
Right.
And
even when you brought up 9/11, the way you describe, you know, the planes going in and people jumping off the building, it sounded like you were recalling a very vivid picture.
And then the other way I reacted is the New York Times never published the diagram how that building was built. The Chicago Trib did. I looked at that design and I said, what a piece of crap. No wonder it fell down. That shouldn't have happened. You see, and then I got kind of angry when I saw it. I'm going, you gotta be kidding. That's how they built that? You gotta be joking. That should not have come down. And it turned out they cheated on the fasteners. It shouldn't unzip like that. You see, that's my engineering side going, man, the plane hit at great tensile strength. Why did that collapse? That building would have come down in a conventional fire if the sprinklers had failed. You see, that's where my engineering side gets into it. They will never, ever build a building with that design ever again. Because it's a piece of junk.
Okay.
See, and I get kind of mad when I think about it, and I'm seeing the diagram of it, of how it was built right now. Complete piece of garbage, that building.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been a really fascinating presentation. I'm wondering if there's one thing you would like people to know about those who are autistic, what would it be?
Well, first of all, you've got this huge spectrum. Also, the other thing you've got to remember, the doctors kept changing the guidelines. You see, back in the 80s, you had to have speech delay to be labeled autistic, which I had. Then they put the Asperger's in the early 90s. That's socially awkward, no speech delay. That'd be Elon Musk. And then they merged it all together. So now you've got somebody very severe, nonverbal with epilepsy with the same name as Elon Musk. Does that make sense? You see, it's a visual thinker that makes absolutely no sense. And you get into places where there's a lot of engineers. I think to be a good engineer, you have to be somewhat on the spectrum.
Wow.
But the thing that, yeah, and I get lonely. I want to get out and do things. I mean, the only way the lockdown was terrible, and I had people that we would have lunch out on gazebo really carefully, and nobody came if they were sick. And but my coping strategy was to know everything about COVID. Yes, and I had all the drugs that supposedly don't work. Well, we won't talk about that because I don't want to get in trouble for giving out misinformation about COVID, but I knew enough. I was pretty sure I could save my butt if I got it.
You're saying that knowledge works to combat your anxiety.
To combat the anxiety, I'd spend hours on this computer on Google Scholar deep into anti-inflammatory characteristics of certain drugs. Put it that way. You know what I learned? It's all about timing. It's all about timing.
So is it a way of like controlling the outcome? Like if you have knowledge, then you can control
I have
the
knowledge,
outcome.
and then if I got sick, I know very decisively what I could do to maybe save my butt.
And so that reduces your anxiety.
That reduced my anxiety. I spent hours looking up journal articles, hours.
Wow. Wow. Thank you.
And then I also jumped on the opportunity to do every Zoom call I could do. And then I had things that I did. I mean, we had people, we ate lunch with certain, like our quarantine circle. But in terms of all my events were canceled. Everything was canceled for a year.
I read that depending which area of the country a child is in, the statistics are different regarding how many are diagnosed on the spectrum. Can you comment on that?
Well, the problem is, this isn't like you do a lab test for tuberculosis or COVID, where you've either got it or you don't, or you do a home test for COVID. It's a behavioral profile. And you see all these granddads that come to me at meetings, plus the people I worked with professionally that were definitely on the spectrum, owning big metal fabrication companies. They will be all diagnosed today. And one of my big concerns, and this is why we did this book, is we're trying to bust everybody out of the autism box, where I'm seeing too many kids where they don't learn any skills. I mean, like shopping. I mean, this is ridiculous. It's the most basic stuff. And they're not learning how to work. Where all the people I worked with, they had paper routes. They worked in a store when they were a kid. They shoveled snow. They walked dogs. They did stuff.
So you're saying kids are labeled and then it's assumed that they're not capable. So they're not
Well,
being...
they get into thinking that the kid can't do anything. There's a tendency, especially for the moms, and I think their emotions are clouding some of their judgment. They almost like smother the kid. And the kid's going nowhere. And the kid's ending up on a disability check.
Wow.
And the other worst thing the schools ever did was taking out all the hands-on classes: sewing, cooking, art, woodworking, auto shop, drafting, musical instruments. All of these things that expose kids to possible career options. Because I'm seeing too many of these kids where they ought to be working for Google and they're playing video games in the basement. I've had parents get so locked into the labels. You got 2 computer programmers. They got an 8-year-old that's a math whiz, and they never thought to teach them programming because they were so locked into the label.
Fascinating.
So is there any advocacy?
This might be where neurotypical emotions are holding these kids back. Think about it.
is there any advocacy in the school systems or the general education system for things to be different, to go
Well,
back to
actually,
the,
Texas is putting a lot of the classes back in. You know, there's some starting to put it back in, but most of the people I worked with that ended up having these shops, they took welding in high school. You see, that's but it's the big problem, but I don't know what to teach the kids in school, because we got graduate students the last 5 or 6 years, they can't write. Their writing skills are horrible. I found out they got through school without writing book reports, which teaches you how to summarize, and nobody marked up their work and corrected their grammar. They're
Wow.
just not learning working. I don't know. I have to do high school grammar corrections on graduate student journal articles. Like, really? This is something relatively recent. And I was a terrible student. My 9th grade writing was better than a lot of my graduate students. Well, here's the thing about the, you know, they oftentimes mix up autism and ADHD. Now, there's some symptoms that are opposites, but there are also some symptoms with some of the social differences that are more similar. They're both, you know, developmental. And the way I combated fear, well, I learned a lot about COVID.
okay, let's go back to
And
Elliot.
then I got in trouble for discussing it. So you know what I did? I said, well, I'll just keep it to myself. I'll save my butt then.
Right.
Because I got in too much trouble for writing an article about it. So I'll just keep it to myself. So I did. And then close people I know, I'd help them.
Let's go back to Elliot. Go ahead, Elliot.
Okay.
Yeah, I have 2 more questions. One question is, do you have a favorite joke?
Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Well, then I think about things I can get really laughing about, like the world's worst vomit flights I've been on.
Yeah. Well, what makes you laugh? I guess that's what I'm asking.
I don't know. That was American Airlines, New York to Phoenix. I'll never forget this flight. We get up to about altitude. This guy gets up in the front of the plane and he tries to get to the restroom. He pukes on it about a third of the entire plane. It was so gross.
Okay. Right. And the other question I have is, you know, it sounds like you've been through Google and you probably are an expert in Google. Have you ever Googled God? And what's your impression of who God is?
Hubble Deep Space Field.
Okay.
Thousands and thousands of galaxies. And when the guy who did that experiment, he pointed the Hubble at a blank piece of space next to the Big Dipper. NASA thought there was a stupid waste of valuable Hubble observing time. And he hit the jackpot and saw thousands of galaxies by pointing the Hubble at nothing.
Mhm.
Hubble Deep Space Field. You can look it up on Google.
Okay. So that's astronomical. Do you have a relationship with God?
I don't know. Hubble Deep Space Field.
Hubble space. Okay.
And the other thing I've learned about religion, it's a topic that's best avoided. Yep, because the thing is, right now, I'm a Star Trek fan. Prime Directive. You got the Prime Directive. My Prime Directive right now, the age, I'll be 75 this summer, and I'll never have to take my shoes off at the airport ever again. Is I'd like to see these kids that are different get into satisfying careers. And I don't discuss politics because that I'd lose half my audience and I want a big audience on helping kids that are different get into really satisfying careers. Constructive, where they can be constructive citizens of the world. And when it comes to religion, I have written it up in Thinking in Pictures. You pound in the golden rule, one specific example at a time. It's not abstract. Every religion has the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. And then I'm thinking about wallets I've returned, things like that. I'm not saying that's not Mother Teresa, but I let, just today, I was coming back home from the grocery store and I held back traffic to let 2 cars come out of a side street, and I waved at them. I waved them in. Okay, that was a little tiny good deed I did today.
Good for
That's
you.
golden rule. You see, that's how I think about it. And I'm kind of happy. And I'm seeing, I said, now come on, go. Those 2 cars on a side street. And then we went like that. Okay, that's a nice little golden rule right there. You see, that's the way I look at it. One specific example at a time. That's a little nice thing I did. Because I've sat in those side streets by that grocery store, and it's hard to get out.
All right, let's go back to Naomi. Go ahead, Naomi. And we have a couple of other questions.
Okay, hi. 2 more questions that are not really related. One of them is you were describing sitting in your quarantine circle at lunchtime, and now you're talking about letting cars go. What is it? Is it a feeling that it gives you? Is it a thought? Is it a picture?
I don't
What
know.
is
I just looked at them and I thought the nice thing to do would be to wave those 2 cars out of that side street.
So when you're sitting in
And
that
and then I pulled up and I go, I did my nice thing for today. And then I thought about an article I wrote about a guy who makes little toys. And he'd had them shipped in from a factory in China. And everybody was throwing a fit on this trucking company, swearing at them and everything else. And he said, I went up and I was super nice and polite, and I got a truck, and nobody else did. And as I drove away, I go, the nice person gets the truck to put their container of toys on.
So when you sat in that circle, what did that give you? Clearly it was important to you. Everybody else was in lockdown.
Well, we talk about our projects. I want to, I don't want to be alone all the time. And we'd have lunch in the gazebo every Tuesday. And it was outside, and back then, that was the original COVID. It wasn't quite as infections. I found that one thing that helped me was having a schedule. The astronauts do that on the space station. They've learned some lessons about how to work with people stuffed up in the space station. And one of the things they learned is get up in the morning. You have your work you do in the morning. Then they have lunch, and they all have it together. And then they have exercise, and then they have time off where they can do goofy things with a satellite phone, or one of the things they like to do, call up their friends on the ground on a satellite phone and do goofy jokes. And
You're always learning from the things around you. My other question is a totally different question. What do you think about somebody who's diagnosed with ASD, knowing about the diagnosis? From what age? Is it helpful? What do you think about that?
well, I think an adult definitely needs to know, because I've talked to a lot of older adults, might be 50, and they get a diagnosis, and they find it's a great relief because it explains why they weren't getting along in their relationships. That's why I did this book. I edited this book, Different Not Less. 18 people diagnosed later in life, all employed in decent jobs. And it was like a relief, because then they understood why they had problems with their relationships.
Okay, let's take a question from Chevy. Go ahead.
Hi, first I want to say thank you for everything. I really admire your work. Part of what I do is teaching social skills to teenagers. And one of my clients in particular is a huge fan, and she hopes to grow up to do research in like you do. So I'm just telling you that in her name. She's gonna be thrilled to hear that I've, mentioned this. That's first, and then another one, I have is there anything you have to say to children whose parents are diagnosed with ASD? I know several children who are in therapy, some are not in therapy, who are struggling. They don't understand their parents' behavior or one parent's behavior. They are not autistic themselves. They're normally developing, and they are hurt a lot of times by certain things that their parents
do. They think the engineer dad doesn't love them.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's where the kid needs to get taught some engineering from dad, so they can do some things together. But sometimes you see, just knowing that that's what they should do. You see, this is where these people get diagnosed later in life. Then I've had people come up to me in the airport and said, well, your book's saved our marriage because now I understand my engineering husband.
Wow.
Yeah, it's you know, then there's a question up there about mainstreaming. I mean, most of the time I want to see kids mainstream as much as possible. But I can tell you something I don't want to see. I don't want to see a 12-year, this is a specific example. I remember going to this very fancy autism school, 12-year-old playing around on a laptop, fully verbal, in a whole classroom with nonverbals. That's something I don't want to see. That's not acceptable because he's not going to go anywhere. And I think things like pounding in the golden rule, one specific example at a time, is very important. Okay, so I gave wallet back at the airport. I let 2 cars get out of a side street. Okay, those are small things, but they're important things. I'm sure the lady that left her, I was in the restroom just the other day, and a lady left her phone on top of the toilet paper holder. And I went in the bathroom and I said, "Oh, whose phone is this?" It was in the stall, and this lady was very grateful. Gave her phone back. I would want I'd want my phone back if I left it somewhere.
Temple, we're going to take one more question from Susie, and then I have a question for you that may be a little bit more delicate. But go ahead, Susie.
Hi. First of all, I want to tell you that when I was in high school, I watched the movie that was made on you and your life. And since then, I was like, I need to meet this woman, and I'm very excited that I got to meet you, and I learned a lot from you tonight. So thank you.
What did you find the most helpful that I talked about tonight?
The way you talked about the pictures, actually, when you held up the book, I ordered on Amazon while you held it up. The way you view your thinking and how you see it in pictures, I actually noticed it later. You didn't realize you explained it so vividly when you repeated a joke something you found funny. I saw how it literally came up in your mind as if it was happening, and you found it just as funny again because you were viewing it again.
Well, that's right. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I see it, and I can get
Right.
laughing. I
Which
get
is
laughing about kind of silly
right,
things.
which is different than how I view something funny, and then I saw funny, and then I repeat it. It's not as funny as the first time because I don't see it in pictures. So I thought that was very interesting how you kind of proved what you were saying within this conversation. So
well, I can also get very upset. Like I was reading about a scientist that studied dinosaurs and whales and things. He was in Ukraine, and he couldn't save his fossils, but he downloaded very precise pictures onto a single portable hard drive. And I started crying when I read that. Like all his life's work was on this little portable hard drive thing. And he had a really hard, and he was trying to get it downloaded to his colleague in France, his whole life's work on a single portable hard drive. Now, I got really emotional about that. And yeah, I can't even talk about that now. And the most important thing to him then was to get the information on that hard drive out at another place. Because let's say he dropped it in a puddle or whatever, his life's work be gone. Wow. See, I got, now I can't even look at a portable hard drive now. I get upset. Wow. I'm starting to get upset now talking about it. Because now I associate portable hard drives with that. You know, I'm not talking about a memory stick. Yes, so much, things that box about like that.
Yeah. It's amazing to hear that.
If I had that, and I'd probably be putting it under my shirt so that it wouldn't get lost. But you see, that's his life's work downloaded onto a single hard drive, which is not a very sturdy media.
Wow.
And then he tried to find internet connections where he could try to download some of it to his friend in France. And
I think another piece that I really took from tonight was that a lot of times individuals who are neurotypical or clinicians who are working with people on the autism spectrum are very much trying to have them think like us, feel like us, associate like us, connect like us, when really what I got out of this is we need to stop and literally put ourselves in that way of thinking, and go from that perspective, from your perspective, so that we can better help people learn
Well, the
skills.
other
And
thing is having, okay, what was on that hard drive? All of his work with whale fossils. That's what was on the hard drive. The thing that was the most interesting thing and the most important thing to him. Life's work on whale fossils. You see, now I can't even talk about that now without getting upset. And I'm seeing that part of a hard drive. I don't think I could look those up on a Best Buy or whatever, and I'd be upset just looking at those. I've now associated portable hard drives with life's work.
Wow.
You see, and now you can see I'm getting upset. So I have emotions. But I read that, it was in the Wall Street Journal, and I read that and I cried.
Well,
I hope
when
we
you
managed to save it.
when you are what you do, that's
Yeah.
that's like the death of the person.
Well, if that hard drive broke, that's like dying.
Yeah, that's
And
death.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see, that's sort of, I am what I do. And we need to teach these kids the golden rule, one specific example at a time, so they'll be good person.
Temple
To return wallets, so you find you don't steal them.
to segue, to piggyback on that I am what I do. You know, first of all, I'm very, very grateful at how vulnerable you've made yourself and how much information, self-information you've disclosed tonight. And we've learned so much about you, not just from you, but also about you. And one of the things that you mentioned was celibacy. And I'm wondering, is that something that's common, again, if you know, with individuals with on the autistic spectrum? Is celibacy, is sexual relations or marriage something that's of lesser interest?
There are some that are successfully married, so I'm not saying that that's for everybody. The other thing I learned when I was in high school, I've written about this in my books, is I kind of figured out the rules of the world in high school. And I was at a boarding school. You have really bad things, like you don't kill people, you don't rob banks. Okay, that's really bad things. And then you have your courtesy rules to help people to get along. And then you have illegal but not bad. And we did plenty of that in the construction industry. We'd ask permission for everything we did. We'd never get anything built. And then you have the sins of the system. And the sins of the system are different in different societies. Now, a lot of them are so controversial, I'm not even going to talk about them. But I can talk about, okay, let's say marijuana. Okay, in one state it's legal, the next state it's a felony. So that being an example of a sin of the system. It's different in different places. And this, the stuff I put in the sin of the system category, that's increasing. You know, people, you better know what the sex offender rules are, because those dogs bite. You better card your girlfriend. Depends what state you are in. Age of consent varies. I know it's being a dork, carding your girlfriend, but maybe you better do that.
But is there less marital and sexual interest among people with?
Well, there's people on the spectrum that are married,
but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had interest. It may just be for social reasons or social pressures.
Well, yeah,
or...
it could be. It could be. Some of this stuff you see, like a lot of the dating stuff, that's socially much more complicated. I know how to do business social. Dealing with corporations and things like that's business social. I know how to do that. It's not that hard. But some of this other social, it's too complicated for me. I'd rather talk about concrete forming systems, or how I ripped out the shackling and hoisting system at Spencer Foods. And me and the engineer, we got together and we figured out how to make the accounting work out. That way.
Right. I guess you know what's intriguing to me is the union of a marriage or of a relationship. You know, a sexual relationship and or a marriage relationship is something that's both physical and also emotional. And I can understand if there's a physical interest in two people.
And people in autism do have physical interest. You better follow the rules. You don't get stuck on the sex offender list.
I see what you're saying.
I'd be looking all the statutes up.
So,
You can
so it's one
participate,
of,
but you better know the rules.
so you have, so in other words, it's very, very rules based. You have to know
Oh, it's
what's,
totally rules
what's
based.
prohibited and what's permitted, and then they
And
can
yeah, and
go
you
based
gotta,
on that.
gotta follow those rules or your life is really gonna get messed up.
I see, I see, I
And
see.
you don't download bad stuff online because everything's tracked. Everything is tracked. Nothing is private online, period. Period. I don't care what your settings are.
Okay. Can we take a question from Esther, and then we have a special request? So Esther, go ahead real quick.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to express gratitude to Temple for explaining the need for deep sensory input, you know, the way you depicted it. I remember reading about it years before even the Temple Grandin movie came out. And when I saw it in the movie, I was like, that makes so much sense. And I worked with children for many, many years, you know, on the autism spectrum and with ADHD, and just understanding what that is, and personally understanding what that was like, wow, I'd like to get a machine like that. And now with the weighted blankets becoming so readily
So,
available.
and the thing that's interesting about weighted blankets is that some of these things, the neurotypicals are liking them too.
Yeah. Personally, I love it. And I thank you for that.
And
depiction.
You know, I was looking at okay, I've had my squeeze machine. I've been looking at these massage chairs. Man, it's like a squeeze machine. Some of those chairs are selling now.
Yeah, so I thank you for bringing that to the public awareness. That idea, you know, was like,
and
wow.
Actually, the Thunder shirt for dogs, and it helps dogs a lot with separation distress. So there's about 50 patents online for pressure stuff for dogs and people that refer back to me on Google Patents.
Temple.
We owe you a debt of gratitude. Thank you.
Temple, there was a request. I'm going to put the recording on pause. I want to thank.
The recording's on now.
Yes, because I just want to publicly thank you, Temple, for taking the time to address our crowd tonight and provide this wonderful information on autism. Again, we want to bless you and thank you for the work that you put into this and the insight that you brought to this topic and this very, very important topic for mental health professionals. So thank you for joining us tonight.